Over here.
Yep, got a report for you to sign right here.
All right.
Mr. Secretary.
Go ahead and sign. Or
Yes, sir. Good afternoon and welcome to the June Acreage and Grain Stocks Briefings. My name is Joe Parsons. I serve as chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board here at NASS. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're pleased to have Robert Bonney, Undersecretary for the Farm Production and Conservation Mission Area, as our Secretary Designate today. We're also pleased to have Dr. Cindy Nickerson, USDA's Deputy Chief Economist, and Dr. Shefali Mehta, REE Deputy Undersecretary, with us today. Welcome. Secretary Bonney, I would like to share with you that Melissa Couch, Kyle Bowman, and Matthew Raymer of our regional field offices each provided valuable assistance on the preparation of these reports. I want to express my thanks to each of them for their valuable assistance. I have a few notes for our live streaming audience. The acreage and grain stocks reports are principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of these reports within 1 hour of their release. We will not be taking questions during this briefing from the public. However, NASS staff are available for email or phone questions, and we will host a social media event 1 hour after the release of these data. We strive to have everything presented at this briefing match the official published record. However, should there be any discrepancy between what is presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Lance Honig, Chief of the NASS Crops Branch. Lance?
All right, thank you, Joe. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's briefing. I would say I've got a short presentation for you, but I would not be telling the truth. I've got a lot of information to share with you today between the acreage, grain stocks, and rice stocks report. There's certainly a lot of information to share there. So I'm going to jump in, move things along fairly quickly. Before we talk about numbers, let me just briefly update you on the survey work that we did, preparing for the numbers in all of these reports today. Really three major survey efforts I want to talk about. The first we call our June Ag Survey. This is a farmer-based sample and survey. You can see we sampled just over 64,000 producers between May 28th and June 16th. We essentially asked them, how many acres did you plant, or in some cases still intend to plant, to the various crops this year. We also collect their on-farm storage for grains and oilseeds. In addition to that, in June, we have our June area survey. So instead of sampling producers, we sample segments of land, and then we enumerate everything within the boundary of those segments. You can see nearly 9,100 of those segments. Data collection period pretty similar to what we did with the farmer-based survey. Those 9,100 segments really translate to about 30,000 additional producers that we collect information from. So if you put those two pieces together, you're pretty close to 100,000 producers that we're reaching out to specifically for that information. And then the third survey that I'll mention is the off-farm grain stock survey. Of course, I mentioned we get the on-farm portion from the producers. Obviously, you need to get the off-farm portion from the commercial facilities. There's about 8,200 of those across the country. And so that becomes a sampling base there, May 31st through June 17th for that collection. The map at the bottom here, this is for the June Ag Survey. You can kind of see how those samples of producers were spread across the country. The larger counts in areas where you would probably expect to see more producers for the type of information we're collecting. And this slide shows you how those segments of land are distributed across the country. And again, concentrated in a lot of the same areas that you would probably expect. Now, before we talk about specific numbers, let me talk about something special that we're doing. This gray box appears on the front of the acreage report. We also issued an ASB notice at noon today to announce the plans here as well. As I'm sure you're well aware, a lot of planting delays this season, especially early on, and in particular up in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Part of the survey work, as I mentioned, we not only ask how many acres did you plant, but how many do you still intend to plant. Based on the portion that was left to be planted, in particular in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, we're going to go back, recontact those producers, probably sometime around mid-July, find out what actually happened with those acres that were still expected to be planted. We'll see what the results yield there. If that newly collected data indicates that we need to make any adjustments to the planted acreage estimates in those states, we would publish that in the August crop production report, which will come out on August 12th. So just want to be clear about that before we talk about the numbers that we're publishing today. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the numbers. We'll start things off looking at the principal crop total. FYI, this is a sum of the 22 major crops planted across the U.S. The blue box at the bottom gives you a list of those 22 crops. And you can see we're now estimating 316.3 million acres to those combined 22 crops. That is down 0.3% or 1.09 million acres from the March intentions. And it's also down 0.3% or 876,000 acres from what was planted to those same crops last season. Just to put a little perspective around that, this first chart you see just shows you how that number compares over the recent seasons. Of course, the orange line is the planted area total, harvested area in gold, which we will fill in later this season. But let me give you just a closer look at that as well to adjust this for some program changes that we made back in 2019. So apples and apples here, if you want to look across that entire time span, that lighter orange line kind of puts things on the same playing field. So you can see the 316.3 million acres. We talked about the decline slightly from last year. But you can see pretty close to where we were back in 2015 through 2018. This next map I have for you just highlights those principal crop planted acreage totals by state and how they compare with last year. The way this map is laid out, the top number is the principal crop total for that state. The lower number is the percent change from last season. All the states colored in any shade of blue are increasing from last year. Any shade of red are decreasing, and of course, the deeper the color, the larger the change. And as you can see, as we look across the country, there's a couple other symbols that I haven't mentioned yet. First, anytime you see the pound sign, that indicates a record high. The only record high we see is in Alaska. Not terribly noteworthy there because of the small acreage. But I can tell you that although it's not record high, Illinois, highest total since 2008. Wisconsin, highest total since 1994. So there are portions of the country with pretty large principal crop totals. On the flip side, if you see the ampersand, that indicates a record low. Record lows for California and Georgia this season. And in fact, record low in Georgia, as I mentioned, but also the lowest since 2009 in Florida. So down in that portion of the country, obviously seeing some lower combined totals this season. This next map again highlights the principal crop totals by state, but here you can see the percent change from the estimates published back in the March intention. So this shows you at a quick glance kind of what's happened since March in terms of what farmers were able to do versus what they intended to do. And as you might expect, the biggest change you see there in North Dakota down 6.8%. As I mentioned earlier, that's a portion of the country where obviously planting delays were most prevalent. And in some cases, that very well may have translated into acreage not getting planted at all. We'll get more data on that later on as we go through the season. So with that said, let's go crop by crop and see what's happening there. We'll start with corn. First of all, just to give you a quick glance at what planting progress looked like this season. This is some information from our weekly crop progress and condition report. The red line here is the current season. You can see the previous 5 seasons on there as well. And so it's kind of an interesting year, started very slowly, as you can see, in fact, even slower than 2019. But then things picked up very quickly mid-May, early to mid-May. And you can see we actually ended up well ahead of 2019 in terms of pace for corn. In terms of acreage, we're now estimating 89.9 million acres planted for corn. That's up 0.5%. or just 431,000 acres from the March intentions, still down 3.7% from what was planted last season. Harvested for grain area, we expect a total 81.9 million acres. That's down 4% from what was actually harvested last year. You can see the gray box at the bottom of the page here indicating that of those total acres that were estimated here, 4.03 million of those were still left to be planted based on the reports from the farmers on the survey work that we did. This chart will just give you a quick glance at how those planted and harvested acreage numbers compare over recent seasons. You'll see that the 4% decline from last year, pretty close to where we were back in 2019. This map highlights the corn planted acreage by state and how it compares with last season. You can see mostly red states across the country, declining acreage across most of the growing area, in fact, down or unchanged in 35 of the 48 states. The largest decline again in North Dakota due to the planting delays there. You can see down 27% from what they planted a year earlier. If you'd like to see those same numbers and how they compare with the March intentions, again, you can see that here. Not so much, really more of a mix here in terms of increases and decreases, just depends on, many factors, obviously, that may have changed between March and when the crops actually went into the ground, but nonetheless, you can see what happened there. Also included in the report, we have some information on the percent of the corn acres that were planted using biotech seed. Not much change here from what we've seen in recent seasons. It's been very steady for corn and continues to be that way. Next, we'll take a quick look at how the corn planted acreage estimate compares with the published expectations. The way this graphic is laid out, each of those blue dots represents an individual industry member's published expectation of what the corn acreage estimate would be. The red block indicates the NASS estimate. You can see for corn pretty much right in the middle of the expectations there, so should not be a big surprise today. Next, we'll move on to soybeans. Again, just a quick snapshot of planting progress for soybeans. Again, starting very slowly, did pick up, but certainly finished slower than most seasons, although it did finish ahead of 2019 again. Looking at the acreage estimates, 88.3 million acres estimated to be planted. That's down 2.9% from the March intentions, still up 1.3% from what was planted a year earlier. In fact, if you think about the corn number, we're now back to more corn than soybeans. If you remember back to the intentions, we were actually expecting more soybean acres than corn for only the third time ever. It looks like that did not happen in reality at the end of the day. So more corn than soybeans again this year. Harvested area, we're estimating 87.5 million acres, up 1.4% from last year. Just giving you a quick graphical look at those soybean acres over recent seasons. And I would point out, we're still looking at the third highest planted acreage on record for soybeans. This map shows you the soybean planted acreage by state and how it compares with last year. I would point out the pound signs here, record highs in Illinois, Kentucky, and Wisconsin, up in most of the major producing states, at least in the Corn Belt, with the exception, of course, of Minnesota and North Dakota, based on some of the challenges there. This map highlights those soybean planted acreage totals compared with the March intentions. So you can see a lot of red colored states here. So a lot of the states planting fewer acres than what they had intended back in the early part of March when we surveyed for that survey. Again, looking at the percent of acres planted using biotech seed here for soybeans, very stable with what we've seen. In fact, equal to last year, pretty much in line with what we've seen across all of the previous 5 years. Next, we'll take a look at the published expectations for soybean acreage. A little bit more of a surprise here. You can see that red block indicating the NASS estimate a bit lower than folks were expecting. So maybe a little bit more of a surprise on the soybean acres today. Just to kind of sum things up for corn and soybeans here, obviously a lot of times we kind of look at those two crops together as there's switching that occurs. But overall, you can see the total for those two crops combined, 178.2 million acres. That's still down 1.3% from what was planted to that total last year. You do see a few pound signs. We do still see record high corn and soybean combined in Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, New York, and Wisconsin. And here again, you can see that combined acreage and how it compares with the March intentions. So you can see where those changes occurred between what farmers intended back in early March. Here I've simply taken those published expectations for corn and soybeans and combined them just to give you a quick comparison. Obviously, the soybean decline driving this total a little bit different than what most folks were expecting. Next, we'll move on to cotton. All cotton planted area, 12.5 million acres. That's up 2% from the March intentions, 11.3% more than was planted last season. We'll have our first forecast for harvested area for cotton in August in the crop production report. Again, taking a quick look at that over recent seasons, you can see the highest total planted area since 2019. And looking at it state by state, you can see increases expecting in all states with the exception of Arizona. Largest increases in Texas. That's actually a 750,000 acre increase in Texas compared to last season. And here again, a quick comparison with the current acreage estimates back to the March intentions. You can see really the big increase being driven by Texas, of course, our largest producing state, 4.4%. Or 300,000 acres more than they intended to plant back in March. Taking a quick look at the percent of upland cotton acres that were planted using biotech seed. Again, you can see pretty stable here, down just a little bit from what we saw last year, but as you look over time, you can see we actually see a little more variability year by year for the upland cotton than we did for the corn and soybeans. And last but not least, for cotton, just taking a quick comparison of the published expectations. Not as many published expectations, so not as many dots. As you can see, they're a little bit more spread out as well. So we do fall within the range, more of the dots below, obviously, so maybe a little bit of a surprise in terms of the cotton acres today. Next, move on to winter wheat. Of course, this is our third estimate of the season for the planted area, 34 million acres. We're now estimating that's down 0.7% or just 230,000 acres from what we had previously estimated. It is up 1.1% year over year. 25 million acres now expected to be harvested for grain. That's up 2.1% from what we published in the crop production report earlier this month. Still down 1.8%. Year over year. Taking a quick look at those acres over time. Really the interesting thing here, I think, is the harvested to planted ratio or abandonment rate, depending on how you want to look at it. Looking at that harvested to planted ratio, even though it's up a little bit from what we had previously published this season, that is still the lowest H2P since 2002. It's the second lowest since 1951, and in fact, that's the sixth lowest ever, driven largely by dry conditions, particularly in the southern portion of the growing area this year, leading to higher than normal abandonment. Here you can see the winter wheat planted acres by state and how they compare with last year. Again, mostly increases across the hard red area, although Texas, you can see actually down 1.8%. Again, a lot of dry conditions all season long in Texas. Kind of a mixed bag as we look across the eastern portion of the growing area. Some states up, some states down. And again, just a quick look at that change from March. Not a lot of changes here. Again, overall, fairly small change even to the national total since March. Taking a look at the published expectations, you can see a little bit lower than folks were expecting. Obviously, just not expecting a change at all. You can see those dots pretty much clustered around our previous estimate. But again, a pretty small difference in terms of moving on to other spring wheat, 11.1 million acres estimated to be planted this season. That's down just 0.8% from the March intentions, 2.7% below what was actually planted last season. Harvested area at 10.7 million acres, up 5.3%, so a much higher harvested to planted ratio this year. But if you think back to last season, terribly dry and hot conditions up in the northern portion of the country, really driving abandonment high last year. So this is really much more of a return to a more normal relationship. As you can see on this graphic, you can see those two lines converging much more in line with what you would normally expect for this crop. Taking a quick look at the other spring wheat planted acres and how they compare with last year, you can see increases in Minnesota and South Dakota, but declining acreage across the rest of the growing area. And a quick look at how it compares with the earlier intentions recorded by producers. You can see the Dakotas actually planting more acres than what they had intended, but mostly declines across the rest of the growing area. Looking at the published expectations, not a big surprise here, maybe just a little bit higher than a lot of the folks were expecting, but pretty much in line with quite a few expectations today. Moving on to durum wheat, just shy of 2 million acres planted. That's up 3.2% from the March intentions, 20.9% above what was planted last year. Harvested area, again, 1.9 million acres. You can see a much bigger increase there year over year. Again, as I mentioned for the spring wheat, really higher abandonment last year, more of a return to a normal level, as you can see on the graphic here. Looking at the durum wheat planted acres by state and how they compare with last year, here you can see the big increase really driven by North Dakota and Montana. Of course, they by far account for the majority of the durum wheat planted in the U.S. And comparing back to the March intentions, you can see up 7.1% in North Dakota, pretty sharp decline in Montana, yielding that 3.2% increase overall from the intentions. Looking at the published expectations for durum wheat, you can see the estimate is up toward the high end of the range there, but you're not talking about a huge acreage difference between the midpoint of that range and the NASS estimate today. I'll move fairly quickly through the remaining crops published for acreage in the report. For barley, you can see just over 3 million acres planted. That's up from the March intentions, 14.5% above what was planted last year. Canola just shy of 2 million acres. That's down from both the March intentions and from the previous season. Of course, North Dakota, a key state for canola. Some of the challenges there this season may be impacting that total. Chickpea acreage, you can see up significantly from the March intentions, but still down 5.3% from what was planted last season. Dry beans down from both the intentions and last season. Dry edible peas also down from the March intentions, but 4.2% above what was planted last season. Big drop in flaxseed from both the intentions and last season. Looking at our hay crop for this year, we're expecting 15.5 million acres of alfalfa to be harvested. That's up 1.4% from what was harvested last season. Other hay acres expected to total just over 36 million acres. That's up 1.6% from what was harvested last season. Of course, we did see some lower hay acreages last year, again, because of the dry weather, particularly in the West. So a bit of a rebound expected this season there. Lentils planted 648,000 acres, down nearly 18% from the intentions, 8.5% below what was planted last season. And mustard seed, relatively small acreage crop there, but you can see up 19.4% last year. You can see oats are down from the March intentions and from last season, although a big increase in harvested area. Again, we saw high abandonment last year, much more of a return to normal levels here. Peanuts at 1.54 million acres planted this year, down 1.8% from the March intentions, 2.7% below what was planted last year. Georgia, of course, is our largest producing state for peanuts. They're down 3% from last year. Otherwise, we're seeing increases across several of the other producing states. Potatoes, you can see 910,000 acres planted this season. That's 3.5% below what was planted last year. And in fact, that is a record low planted and harvested area for potatoes this season. Proso millet, 670,000 acres there. You can see that's off 7.6%. And then rapeseed at just 9 million acres. Sorry, 9,000 acres. Relatively small crop there and getting even smaller, as you can see down sharply year over year. Looking at the rice acres, 2.34 million acres. That's down 4.4% from the March intention, 7.5% below what was planted last season. Arkansas, of course, mostly long grain acreage there, down 4% from last year. California, more of a medium short crop there. Water shortages there are really pushing acreage down in California. That's having a big impact on the change, especially since March. In fact, that's the lowest California all rice acreage since 1958. Looking at our rye crop, we're expecting acreage there to be up 1.7%. Bigger increase on the harvested side, although the majority of that crop is not harvested for grain anyway. Safflower up slightly from last year. Sorghum, 6.3 million acres planted this year. Is up a little bit from the March intentions, but off fairly sharply from last year. We had a really big acreage, big crop last year for sorghum, getting back down to a little bit more of a normal level for that crop this season. Sugar beets, 1.178 million acres planted, up 3.1% from the March intentions. I think there was a lot of expectation around that. As you can see, that is indeed what farmers are doing. So now up 1.6% year over year. We had a little more abandonment on that crop last year too. And so you can see the harvested area expected to be up 3.5% from last season. Looking at our sugar cane crop, 924,000 acres expected to be harvested this year. That's down 1.2% year over year. That would represent the lowest total since 2019. Florida is looking at the lowest level since 2011, and Louisiana is down about 1% year over year. Looking at our sunflower crop, you can see a big increase there. A lot of demand for sunflower due to some other things happening around the world this season. And then tobacco, 222,000 acres expected to be harvested this season. Off the March intentions, but still up 1.2% year over year. So we're reversing that trend we had seen for so many years with declining tobacco acres. The next several slides I have just kind of sum up, give you a quick look at what's happening across all of those 22 major crops. First, this chart just showing you the acreage total so you can get some perspective around the different sizes of the acreage for the various crops. Obviously, several crops at the top of the chart here, pretty dominant in terms of total acreage. This next graphic just shows you the percent change from last year. So all the bars moving to the right indicating the increases, the decreases to the left. Again, this is in percentage change. So from a percentage standpoint, you can see sunflowers actually showing the biggest increase year over year, with sorghum showing the largest decrease. But if you want to see that in terms of acreage, again, you can see actually all cotton actually showing the largest acreage increase year over year, while corn by far showing the largest decrease with nearly 3.5 million fewer acres planted this season. So with that said, let's transition over to the stocks. We'll start things off with all wheat stocks because as I'm sure you know, June represents the ending stocks, or fourth quarter stocks for all wheat. So you can see ending stocks for wheat. 660 million bushels. That's down 21.9% from the same time a year earlier. You can see the on-farm portion down 34%, the off-farm down nearly 20% year over year. If we take a look at what's happened across the various seasons for the all wheat stocks, just a quick update on this chart. Each of the vertical bars represents the beginning supply for each of those seasons, and then the 4 lines represent the 4 quarterly stocks estimates. I would point out that all wheat stocks total represents the lowest June 1 stock since the 13-14 season. You can see that 2.49 billion bushel beginning supply was down 12.8% from the previous season. So we came in with a lower supply. Just a quick update on the last quarter, the March to May disappearance, 364 million bushels. That was down 21.8% from the same period a year earlier. Looking at the all wheat stocks and how they compare with the published expectations, pretty much right in line with what most folks appear to be expecting today. We'll move on next to the June 1 corn stocks. Of course, this is third quarter for the corn stocks, so we've got one more quarter to go in the season. But as of June the 1st, 4.35 billion bushels stored. That's up 5.7% from a year earlier. The on-farm stocks up 21.6% from the previous year, but the off-farm stocks down 6%. That's our 12th largest June all corn stocks total. So it's big, but it's not, too big historically speaking. Looking at what's happened with corn over time and over the season here, you can see the 16.3 billion bushel beginning supply here. That was up just 2% year over year in our March to May disappearance. 3.41 billion bushels. That was 4.9% below disappearance a year earlier. Looking at the published expectations for corn stocks and the estimate here, you can see pretty much in line with most of those expectations. A few stray dots down at the bottom that seem to be expecting something a little bit different than everyone else. Moving on to soybean stocks, again, third quarter, just like the corn, 971.4 million bushels. That's up 26.3% from a year earlier. On-farm stocks up 50.7%, off-farm up 16.6%. Really a rebound here from a relatively low last year. We've kind of seen that trend all season long for the soybean stocks, as you can see on this chart. Last year was actually the lowest June stock since 14-15, so that's part of why you see the big increase this year. We did see relatively high exports and crushings this recent quarter, leading to a pretty large disappearance from March to May at 960 million bushels. That's 21.1% higher than the same period a year earlier. Again, looking at the expectations, you can see pretty much right in line with what most folks were expecting today. Moving on to the June 1 rough rice stocks. You can see that total down 9.7% from the same time a year earlier. The on-farm portion down 27.8%, off-farm portion down 7%. The long grain varieties accounted for about 2/3 of the total rough rice stored as of June the 1st. And again, looking at what's happened over the season here, 229 million hundredweight was our beginning supply. Disappearance this quarter, 34.5 million hundredweight compared to 36 million a year earlier. So not much change there year over year. A few other crops included in the stocks report today. You can see barley stocks down 41% from a year earlier. In fact, that is record low June 1 stocks for barley. The previous low was all the way back in 1953. So not a lot of barley on hand right now. Canola stocks down 48.5%. That's the second lowest total since 2013. Chickpea stocks as of June the 1st down 10.5%. On-farm up 79%, but the off-farm down 18.9% there. Dry edible peas stored as of June the 1st down 4.1% year over year. Flaxseed down more than 60% from what was stored a year earlier. And lentils off 35.7% to the lowest June 1 total since 2016. Oat stocks off 14.3% year over year. Rye down 48.2% from a year earlier. Huge increase in sorghum stocks as of June the 1st. But as I mentioned earlier on, we had a really big sorghum crop last season, larger than we would normally see. As a result, we've still got a lot of stocks on hand for sorghum right now. Of course, we see lower acreage this season, probably partially as a result of that. And then last but not least, the durum wheat stocks as of June the 1st, 21.2 million bushels. That's off 22.5% from what was stored a year earlier. This next slide just highlights some of the upcoming reports over the next month. You can see our monthly care reports coming out tomorrow. Next crop production report will be on July the 12th. Of course, we'll get updates on not only winter wheat, but we'll introduce the remaining small grains to our forecast package there. And then, of course, cattle and cattle on feed on July 22nd, and then ag prices and farm production expenditures. Toward the end of the month, as Joe mentioned at the onset of the briefing here, I'll be hosting our, I can't say monthly because it's the second one this month, but I have Stat Chat this afternoon here shortly, which will give folks an opportunity to get on Twitter and ask me any questions that they might have about today's reports and the 2 or 3 numbers that we had included in there. So that is the last slide that I have for you today. So that will wrap things up for us here. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We're going to wrap up our streaming portion of the presentation here, and so we hope to see everybody next time.